sugar. Now it's important, of course, that you distribute that very fine layer of icing sugar to the surface of the plate in a very even fashion. Now initially, when I was experimenting ways of doing this, I started off in a very basic form by just using a cardboard box, which I placed some icing sugar, gave it a jolly good shake, and then while the icing sugar was airborne, I very carefully put a plate inside. I say very carefully, but that proved quite difficult. You only had to knock the edge of the box with your hand, and lumps of icing sugar would start to distribute itself in an uneven layer across the surface. So then I tried different ways by placing the plate inside and agitating the icing sugar by just blowing air in with a hairdryer. This was slightly better, but even so, even when I was removing the plate, it proved difficult to do this without distributing lumps of icing sugar in an uneven fashion across the surface. But what I noticed when I was actually blowing air into the cardboard box, the little flap on the side I'd made to insert the plate, there was a very fine layer of icing sugar blowing out from this flap. And it was that I realised, it was in that kind of area that I really needed to have my plate where the icing sugar was being diffused in a nice even layer. And this box down here is really the result of that understanding. Effectively, what I've got is a large box which has an internal chamber inside where you lay the plate. The icing sugar will sit on a small table above that internal chamber, and the diameter of that large table is just slightly smaller than the internal lower chamber, so it allows the icing sugar to be, if you like, circulated around the side in that same diffused way that that cardboard box did. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to put some icing sugar into a dish, and we'll place it onto that table, and then we will blow the icing sugar around the surface of the plate. Okay, this is just a standard icing sugar. I say standard, icing sugar hasn't got just sugar in it. In fact, it does have what we call anti-caking properties. And if you do check on the side, you'll see that most icing sugars that are sold in Britain anyway do have that property. So it's important that you do have that. Icing sugar is very prone to lumping up, and of course a little bit of dampness and it'll suck it all up and you'll end up lumps. Of course you don't want that, so I always use a sieve initially just to give us that lovely fine quality that we will then put into the dish. So just putting this through a sieve to make sure that that's what I've got that's going into our dish. Surprisingly, you don't need a huge amount of this. Okay, that should be sufficient. Just place that onto our dish. Of course, the larger grains shouldn't become airborne sufficiently that they'll get round the side anyway. So if there are any larger lumps in there, as long as there's not too many, you shouldn't have any problems. Okay, so I'm just going to lift this off, put the icing sugar in the centre above the hole which I've made to insert our hairdryer. Just put that to the side for a moment. This obviously comes away, this top half, so I can clean it. It's a good idea to clean your Icing Sugar Aquatint box occasionally, again, because the sugar can lump up, and if there are any lumps in the bottom, of course, they could be agitated onto the surface of the plate as well. So I'll put the plate now on top of a small grill there on top, and then very carefully lay the top table to there, making sure I don't jog it around too much. Now I just take a standard hairdryer. Obviously it makes sense to have one that's got a fairly good amount of blow to it. You don't need the heat, you need heat at all there. So I just insert the hairdryer in the surface, give it a good blow, circulate that icing sugar. And then, like any aquatint, we just leave it now for about a couple of minutes to allow all that airborne icing sugar to gradually work its way around the side of the box and filter its way down to lay it onto the surface of the plate. It's important, of course, to make sure you put small holes into the corners of the box in order to encourage the airflow to circulate inside the box. If we didn't have holes in the corners, then of course we may not get that nice even, if you like, distribution of the draft and the particles landing on. So it's important you have small holes. It does mean, of course, that you will get that slight smell of candy floss in the air, but as I said earlier, that won't create any harmful effects. Okay, this has been sitting here now for about 3 minutes. Now we're going to just carefully take the top shelf off. You see most of the icing sugar has been blown off the dish, and it should be sitting nice and evenly across our plate. Now obviously you've got to be very careful when you lift the plate at this stage, because a lot of the icing sugar is going to be just sitting on the surface. And you can see, if you're used to making aquatints using rosin, there's probably slightly more icing sugar sitting on this plate than there would be for a rosin aquatint. Now this plate is now sitting here and we're imagining the fact that all those grains are gradually starting to sink down into the surface of this wet ground. So we'll leave this plate stand now for about 5 minutes in order for those grains to sink neatly down into the surface of the ground. Now of course, if you find that you haven't got the facilities or anyone who can actually make you that aquatint box that I've just shown you now, of course you could use a traditional aquatint box, convert it using icing sugar. But if you would like to attempt to make this aquatint, you can do it in a much more simple way by just using a jar, and if you put an old pair of tights over the top, as long as you are careful with the way that you sprinkle the sugar over the surface of the plate, you can achieve the same result. Now I say you can, I can't pretend that it isn't a little bit more difficult, because of course you are trying to lay the icing sugar over the surface in an even fashion, and using just a jar with, as you can see, I'm doing this here and I'm not making a brilliant job of it on this occasion, but I suppose that does illustrate how difficult it is. You may have to, I can probably afford to knock some of this off actually. Not as even as the aquatint box, but it's a sort of thing you could perhaps try and experiment with yourself and see how you get on. One word of note, if you make an aquatint using this jar, if you do distribute too much icing sugar to the surface of the plate, sometimes you can get a very strange result. You'll end up with what look like large areas where the aquatint isn't working in forms of little bubbles. I can only describe it as bubbles. I think that's because the ground hasn't released all the sugar, and when you put it into the ferric chloride, I think it does react and create little gas bubbles which create these little, if you like, effectively what will be white areas on the surface of the aquatint. So the plate's now been standing for about 5 or 10 minutes, somewhere in that kind of region. It's not crucial, as long as you don't put it straight into the oven, or if you haven't got an oven, onto the hot plate, it won't have any detrimental effects. So I'm just going to pop this in now, and you treat it in exactly the same way you would if you were just making a standard hard ground. It goes into the oven for the standard 6 minutes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 minutes at about 130 degrees. Now, as I said earlier, if you haven't got an oven, you need to do your own experiments in order to find out what is the correct length of time on a hot plate, or if you're using a cardboard box which you line with silver foil and a hairdryer, that will take longer. But essentially the time you give this process is exactly the same as you've discovered that is the correct time for your standard hard ground. Okay, now the 6 minutes is up, so I can carefully take these plates out and leave them somewhere to cool down. Now this part is quite important. It is important that you now leave these plates to cool down. I would suggest for at least half an hour. The reason we have to leave the plates cool down for half an hour is because, if you remember when I did my first demonstration showing you how to treat a hard ground, even though the ground itself may appear to have hardened, it still takes a good half an hour for it to cure, to have the kind of strength that it's going to need now in order for us to dissolve those small grains of icing sugar away from the surface without damaging the surface which hasn't been affected by the grain. So leave the plate for at least half an hour before we move on to the next stage. The plate's now had half an hour to cure, so that the surface is nice and stable. So we now need to put the plates with the icing sugar on the top into warm water. And it's not hot. The way I describe it, I mean, you could say it's going to be somewhere in the region of about 40 degrees, but I always say the sign of temperature where it's comfortable for you to put your hand in. I suppose bath temperature would be a good description. So that's fairly warm water, got a little bit more hot in. And then I'm going to submerge the plate which has the sugar on top of it. Now it's important when it's in the water that you're not tempted to just brush the surface, even with cotton wool. If you do that, you will see effectively the scrape marks that you've made while you've been pushing that cotton wool across the surface. So it's really just a matter of just agitating the plate in the warm water to help dissolve those little grains of icing sugar. When you take the plate out to inspect it, if you still see any evidence of sugar on the surface, then I would place it back in and keep doing it. I would suggest you err on the cautious side with this part of the process and really let it agitate the plate around the surface, obviously making sure you don't touch the surface of the plate. This is a very delicate aquatint. You'll discover that the finer the aquatint you make, and of course the icing sugar aquatint is a very fine aquatint, the finer aquatint you make, the more caution you're going to have to take and more careful you're going to have to be with the way that you treat it right through to that final print. But of course you can get very nice reward from following that process with the beautifully fine results you can achieve. I'm just going to change this warm water, put some fresh in, so that I can be absolutely sure that this plate is completely dissolved. So I'll just leave this to the side and I'll replace this water with some fresh. So I'm just going to put this is a fresh batch of water, just to be on the absolute certainty that we have removed all the sugar. It's dissolved away and we're just left now with the plate, which if you were to inspect it with a powerful magnifying glass, you'd see there are lots and lots of tiny little holes. You probably see, even by just looking at the plate, it's taken on a much lighter, pinker finish, and that's really because, of course, what we've actually got here is, in a sense, the same as this aquatint we started off at the beginning. There's tiny little holes in the surface of this plate which gives you a lighter tone. When you come to dry the plate, I would very carefully lay a sheet of newsprint on the surface, just to take off the residue of water that may be sitting on top of the aquatint. You could just put it in the oven and let the water evaporate away, but even then, if you're using water which has quite a lot of chlorine in it, some of that chlorine could end up just sitting on the surface, and that could have an adverse effect. So very gently dabbing with a piece of newsprint I think is probably the best. Whatever you do, don't obviously rub the surface, as I keep trying